Hello, it's Jacob again, and in this video, we'll be talking about supply. Now, supply is pretty much just the flip side of demand. Demand being from the consumer's perspective, supply being from the producer's perspective. And what supply is it is a mapping from a price to a quantity supplied, to the quantity that the producer wants to sell at a given price. And being a mapping, we can draw it as a curve, just like we do with demand. So you see on this graph, you have the supply of gewgaws, you have quantity on the horizontal axis, and you have price on the vertical axis. Now, much like with demand and its law of demand, we generally assume that supply follows a law of supply. It states that as the price of a good rises, the quantity supplied will rise or stay the same. And graphically, this is going to be the same thing as the supply curve being upward sloped. So, looking again at this graph, it goes up, doesn't it? If I raise one, then I raise the other in tandem. They're positively correlated. Now, unlike the law of demand, we have no theoretical violations of the law of supply. It's almost just a common sense idea. If I were to pay you more to do something, you would do more of it, wouldn't you? Well, as a rule. But we still need to look a little closer at the logic of it. And there are two main reasons I have to share with you why we would expect the law of supply to hold. And the first one is that principle of diminishing returns. And the second one is what I call the hunt for profits. Now, diminishing returns. We've already seen this with demand. In fact, with demand, what we saw is that you could interpret from a demand curve, from its definition, the marginal benefits of the good at every quantity consumed. And because a good generally becomes less useful the more of it you have, we expect those marginal benefits to decline as the quantity increases. And so the demand curve would have to slope downwards. But the cost of the good is going to stay the same, because that cost is the price. With supply, it's the exact opposite. As a producer, you're producing, you are making something and selling it in order to make a profit. What are the benefits? It's the revenues that you bring in. What are the costs? It's what you have to give up in order to make the good. And the profit is the gap between those two. It's the revenues minus the costs. So your benefit as a producer stays the same because you don't affect the price. But your marginal costs, they increase as you raise production. Now, why would we expect the marginal cost to increase? Well, let's think about what it would take to increase output. If you want more output, you have to spend more resources. We could be talking about workers. I hire more employees, and so I'm able to get more work done. We could be talking about capital, machinery, tools, land. I hire more of those to get the work done. But either way, you need to employ more resources. But at the same time, we're talking marginal, not total. So why would you expect the marginal unit of output to take more extra resources than the unit before it? Well, let's think about it. More workers and more machines are always going to help. But is that second worker going to be as productive as the first worker? Is the third worker going to be as productive as the second worker? And likewise with machines, likewise with land. It's a general principle that there are ideal proportions to each factor of production. That you have the appropriate amount of tools, the appropriate machinery for each worker. You have the appropriate amount of land for each worker. Everything has to be proportional. You have to have the proper amount in order to produce efficiently. That there isn't too much downtime, that machines lay idle, or that workers lay idle because they don't have a machine to work at. And if you raise one factor beyond its proportion, it's going to raise output, but it won't do so as efficiently. Now, I can give you several different examples of this. I have a big interest in farming. I'm not from a farm family. I like the idea of it. And so you could imagine this working with crop fields. If you're a farmer, what field are you going to use first? Your best field? Your worst field? Your second best field? You're going to use your best field, won't you? You're going to use the field that has the best soil, the field that's easiest to work on, the field that will give you the largest yield. Then, if you wanted to increase the yield of your crops, what would you have to do? Well, it takes more land to grow more crops. And so you're going to cultivate another field. And that second field, if it's the same size, if it's the same crop you're planting, you would expect it would take the same amount of labor, roughly, to harvest it. But that second field isn't going to yield as much. It's a worse field. The soil's not as good. There might be more rocks in the ground. You would expect that as you increase output, as you grow more and more food, the productivity of additional fields would have to decline. Even if the yield is positive, the yield is by necessity going to become smaller and smaller because you always use your best options first. This applies in other places too, not just agriculture. Imagine if you had an assembly line, or maybe we're talking about like a fast food restaurant, which has an assembly line approach to preparing food. If you have all of the machines you need, all of the fryers, all of the stoves, all of the cash registers, all of the different components of the business are in their proper place, and then you have workers for all of them, what would it do to add another worker? Well, as long as you can at least keep that worker out of the way when they're not needed, that worker isn't going to reduce production. You're not going to flip burger patties slower because you have more employees. But that worker isn't going to add as much, will they? You'll have times when the pace of work gets so fast that having an extra gopher around helps. Or someone needs to go take a restroom break, and that spare is able to step in and keep the line running at full speed. Or there's an accident out in the the dining area, and that extra worker is able to go take care of it. The line runs smoother than it would have done without that person. And yet that person is not as productive as the previous workers because you cannot fully employ them like you did the previous workers. Some of their time is necessarily going to be wasted, or it's going to be used on trivial tasks. This principle is essentially where diminishing returns in production come from. Everything has to have its proper amount, and if you exceed that, then you will raise production, but not by as much. Production efficiency falls even if production itself increases. Now, some of you that have practical experience in the workplace, or maybe some of you who might be studying industrial engineering, you may be skeptical right now. You say, Mr. Campbell, I know that that's not how it works. Because there's things called economies of scale. Maybe you've heard that term. Maybe you only know the idea and don't know the word for it. Rest assured, we're going to talk about economies of scale later in the course. They're very important to understanding competition and how monopolies form. And so it's in the competition lecture that we go back to that. But suffice it to say that for short-term planning, this is going to hold true. At a higher level of output, it might be possible to implement a different technology, an entirely different production line, production technique. But if you're talking about the same business, the same basic setup, diminishing returns are going to hold. Now, what is the implication of this for supply? Well, raising the quantity is going to require a disproportionate increase in inputs. And if those inputs have themselves the same price, that means a disproportionate increase in cost. And as a producer, you're only willing to produce when the marginal revenue exceeds the marginal cost. When that good would be able to pay for itself. And so if the marginal cost increases, you're going to require a higher price in order to be willing to produce at that greater level. Thus, the quantity supplied and the marginal cost are going to move together, and you get an upward sloped demand curve. Now, we'll move over to the other argument. So, producers also generally have alternatives of where to invest their money. This isn't always true. And again, when we get to competition, we'll talk about how limits on where they can go may affect their behavior, so-called barriers to entry and exit. But in general, given enough time, a producer can choose to produce something else. They might sell one factory and start a different factory. They might change their occupation. I didn't clarify, but workers are considered producers. They produce the service of labor that they sell to employers. You sell your labor in the labor market. Now, producers will, all else being equal, want to invest in their most profitable businesses first. You could complicate this a little bit. There are compensating differentials, if you happen to remember that phrase I used a few videos ago. Some people might get additional benefits, non-monetary benefits, from staying in a certain line of work. But everybody likes profits. So all else being equal, if there is no personal preference about the line of work, the producer is going to want to invest in the most profitable business. And so if prices fall, then the profit is also going to fall, right? The revenues fall, so the profit falls. And the producer is going to want to shift into other businesses that are relatively more profitable now. They're going to move into a business as long as the profits there are higher. And so when the profits in that business are equal to other businesses, everything's even, right? They're not changing their behavior. So then if the price falls for one business, they're going to want to move to the other ones to compensate. And likewise, if prices increase, the producer is going to want to step up production since that business is relatively profitable now. Now, what are some of the factors that cause supply to move around? Well, we saw with demand how, because demand is a curve of marginal benefits, anything that changed the benefits of owning the good would change the demand. Well, likewise, since supply shows us the costs of producing a good, anything that would increase the costs would reduce supply. We call that a negative shock. And anything that decreases the cost would increase the supply. And we call that a positive supply shock. And also, like with demand, supply will increase if the number of producers increases, and it will decrease if the number of consumers decreases. As with demand, supply is going to have a different definition depending on what kind of question you're trying to answer. We could be talking about an individual firm supply, or we could be talking about a market. Likewise, we could be talking about a category of goods or a specific brand. It depends on, what problem you're studying. Now, what are some of the specific things that are going to cause the supply curve to move? What are some specific things that affect the cost? Well, the most notable one is going to be the factors of production, right? Everything that is used to make the good. So labor, who you have to pay wages to. Capital that you have to either buy or rent. And that, again, is machinery, tools, things like that. Land that you have to buy or rent. And even legal rights can be considered factors of production. A factor of production doesn't have to be a physical thing. It can also include licensing fees. It could include legal fees. It could include insurance. A lot of businesses are required to have insurance. And if that factor's price increases, so would the marginal cost of making the good. You have to pay more for the resources, pay more for the inputs. And thus, that supply will go down. At every quantity, you see there is a higher cost. Technology is also going to affect supply. So suppose technology improves and it becomes possible to make more of the good with the same inputs. Or perhaps it would be better to say more of the good with a similar expenditure on inputs. It could be that you found a more efficient way to use the same resources, or it could be that a newer, cheaper resource has come along. In either case, that reduces your cost of production, and so supply is going to increase. You get a positive shock. And note on that graph how at every quantity, the cost is lower, or equivalently at every price, the quantity supplied goes up. Like with demand, expectations are going to play a role. Producers may produce more to stockpile when factors are cheap, for example. If you have the warehouse space, you would want to profit as much as you can from abnormally cheap labor, from abnormally cheap resources. And like how different goods can affect each other's demand, different goods can affect each other's supply as well. So producers will increase supply if other markets have falling profits. You could compare this to your complements, right? A change in the price of one affects the demand of the other. Well, likewise here, if if another market has become relatively more profitable, you're going to want to decrease your supply in response. If another market has become less profitable, you're going to see supply increase as people move away from unprofitable markets and move into profitable markets. And sometimes goods can also be made as part of the same production line, and we call this situation joint supply. Now, joint supply shows up in a lot of places. A lot of industrial processes produce chemicals as byproduct, and these chemicals can themselves be sold. You'll have factories that exist to make one specific product, but they'll pipe off their runoff to other factories to be used. For the most part, though, where you really see joint supply thrive is in food processing. Because rarely do you get just one product out of an animal. So, for example, let's consider this cow. You wouldn't kill a cow just to make one cut of steak. Within this cow, you have at least, I mean, in this graph, it's what, 12 different cuts of meat. You've got beef chuck, you've got a brisket cut, you've got rump cut, you've got a round cut. You have a lot of different products, and each one of them is a distinct product. But it's going to cost you the same amount either way to raise and slaughter a cow. So the supply of all of them goes together. And what's the producer going to do? Well, instead of determining their quantity supplied based on the individual price, they're going to base their quantity supplied on the price of the entire basket, the entire bundle. So, if ribeye steak were to become more expensive, you would expect the supply of shank meat to increase. If for no other reason than because producing more ribeye steak necessarily involves producing more shank meat as a byproduct. Goods can also be affected by the same good in other markets, too. Depending on our level of aggregation, we consider the same good in a different time or place to be a different good or market. And if prices are higher in one place, you'd want to buy low and sell high. And this is called arbitrage. Now, arbitrage is usually specialized in by third parties as opposed to the original producer. You've got, historically, you would think of your merchants. Today, you would think of your shipping companies, truck drivers, and big cargo ships and whatnot. The stores that they sell the products in. But from the producer's perspective, their supply is going to be determined by changes in other markets as well. If the price is going up in some other place, you're going to increase your supply of goods going to that place. You're going to want to export more and produce domestically less. So, for example, if wheat prices in California were to shoot up, then wheat farmers in South Carolina, you would expect them to produce more wheat for California and less wheat for South Carolina. And thus the supply of wheat to California increases, the supply of wheat to South Carolina decreases. Arbitrage can also be done over time and not just space. I want to buy low now in order to sell high in the future. And we call that speculation. Now, speculation takes different forms. Sometimes it can involve actually buying the good and then warehousing it until you intend to resell. Usually, though, it takes the form of what's called a futures contract. In a futures contract, you strike a deal that says, I promise that I will buy this from you and I'll go ahead and pay you, but I promise that I will buy a certain amount from you for a certain price in the future. You're sort of pre-ordering it in a sense. And when speculators specialize in this, it acts as a sort of price insurance, guaranteeing that the price is a little more stable for the producer. So, in conclusion, the law of supply states that as prices rise, the quantity supplied of a product will rise or stay the same. The law of supply is caused by diminishing returns in production and the hunt for profits. Increasing the prices of factors of production will reduce supply. Increasing technology will increase supply. And increasing profits in other markets will reduce supply. Our supply curve is a mapping of prices to quantities, and it shows the opportunity cost of each marginal unit. And anything that increases those costs will reduce supply, while anything that decreases them will increase supply. Now, in our next lecture, we'll learn about a concept called elasticity, essentially what determines how steep the curve is. And then with that last piece, we'll be able to combine supply and demand into one graph that will show us how prices and quantities are determined. And then from there, we'll be able to see the effects of supply and demand shocks, or even both of them happening at the same time, on prices and quantities.